Happy New Year and welcome to our weekly discussion of current affairs, moral side of the news. We are glad you're here today. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me is a distinguished panel once again today. Reverend Sally McClain, retired Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Rabbi Stan Miles, Louisville Melton School. Reverend Clay Calloway, West Louisville Ministers Coalition. And Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. First, let me begin with Happy New Year to our panelists today. It's our first show of 2022, but the headlines read just like last year. COVID continues to make its mark here at home. A couple of related items to discuss today. One, with the dramatic rise of the COVID-19 Omicron variant, Louisville Metro opened a mass testing site at Churchill Downs this week. Two, that Omicron variant has Jefferson County Public Schools back with at-home remote instruction. And three, despite the COVID numbers, the University of Louisville administration has threatened faculty and staff, telling them they must host classes in person. Now, as we record this program, that has relaxed a little bit, but let's turn to our panel. Your response to these two opposite approaches to COVID and classroom instruction. Let's get your thoughts.
I just wish people would get vaccinated. I think that if people would have gotten vaccinated in the numbers and percentages that we needed people to be vaccinated, we would be looking far into our rearview mirror at the circumstances that we're dealing with here and now.
I think the other thing is that we probably need to look at is that I'm afraid that while we're in variant number 2, there's going to be variant number 3 and 4 and 5 that we may be years before we get out of the so-called COVID-19 mess, which means how do we redo that? Obviously, if everybody could be vaccinated, that would be super helpful. But the reality is we've got lots of people who refuse to get vaccinated. So what do? And that's why we're seeing some of these things here. I worry about the hospital staffs because they are overwhelmed by so much. And a lot of, in other cities, not our own at this point in time, at least Louisville, that people who need other kinds of hospital things are still being able to get into the hospitals. But in parts of our country, that's not happening. That's dangerous for all kinds of reasons. So it's really a difficult type of thing. I guess we'll get into the schools in a second, but that's kind of a general idea. Clay?
I'm not sure that people realize how serious COVID can be for some. My husband and I both had COVID in November a year ago, not this past November, but the year before, right before the vaccines came out. He has just endured a 7.5-hour surgery to remove the leftover COVID scarring from his lungs. So people do not understand, especially if you're compromised in some way, that COVID is going to attack the weakest part of your body. And it can do this phenomenal damage. And so, how can you convince people? They're talking about herd immunity. Well, I don't remember that smallpox or polio was wiped out because of herd immunity. It wasn't.
Well, I mean, if I might just add on with our as the last pip in the show, we talked earlier about Sally being Gladys and we're the pips today, the 3 pips, and I'm glad to make that analogy as the last pip chiming in on the show. I had to get that in, Sally. It is this the news. You have to really be careful about the data. Look at the data. It's bad, but it could be much, much worse. Like Rabbi Miles said, it's if we just get vaccinated, it would be better. But if we were not as vaccinated as we are, it would be much, much worse. The numbers I saw just this morning, it talked about the Omicron variant is much more contagious, but it's not nearly as deadly. And it's not nearly as deadly to those who have vaccines. The ones who show the worst numbers are the ones with the least vaccinations.
Right.
So you can still get it, but those that are not vaccinated are affected the most and the worst. So that's a fact. Another fact is in Kentucky, we don't have the hospitalization stresses that many of the nation has. That's good news too, even though the positivity rating is high, relatively high. The hospitalizations are relatively moderate compared to the nation. So that's good news for Kentucky. Another good news point is that generally, I don't know if it was nationwide or in the state of California, New York, wherever it was, out of all the hospitalizations, there was not a single person on a ventilator, not one.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a clear indicator of the severity of the effect of the disease on the body. Even though Omicron is more contagious, but it's not nearly as deadly. It is not sending as many people to the hospital, and that is almost exclusively because of the protection of the vaccination. So the argument for vaccines has withstood the test of Delta and Omicron, in my opinion. Okay, so that's good news. So vaccine, and then to add another vaccine, to add another pip to that chorus, get some more vaccine. That's the name of that song. That's the song we're singing, and we should be singing together.
And
Hey, I'm going to add another litany to your vaccine.
Okay.
I'm going to add mask.
Absolutely. There's no substitute for mask, right? That's a firewall.
And again, we're going to have to be looking at the quality of our masks. Some have been better than others. And I know they're kind of pushing on that because the cloth ones are not near as effective as some of the others. And I think, I appreciate what you said, Clay, that a lot of good signs. I think the other thing is that Omicron doesn't seem to last as long. And some doctors think that in another 6 weeks or so, this huge jump may diminish. And that will help all the other problems that we're talking about in terms of schools and others. But I do think we've got to be careful, especially right now. And while churches encourage this, it's the common good. What's the best for the common good of all the people and not just myself? And we've said this many times, overt, almost ad nauseum, but it's like I sometimes don't get the opposition other than it's political, that it's limiting my freedom somehow. But well, they're still getting their driver's licenses. They're still getting other things that they've got to get. You've got to fill out papers if you want to go into a hospital. Is that becomes an absurd argument after a while.
Right. I agree with you. It is absurd.
All right. What about the education question? The two different treatments, JCPS, in-home instruction. U of L says, let's be in person most of the time. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think U of L is backing off of that a little bit. And that seemed a little bit strange. Now, I know that because I've talked to several of JCPS teachers, this going back to virtual learning came on them relatively quickly after the Christmas break. So they were a little bit frustrated of having to adjust everything after they just adjusted after everything. And God knows the teachers are put in a terrible position. And thank goodness it's only for 4 days at this point. But I don't think in the long term, virtual education is the ideal step for most of our kids, and especially our public schools. But then you still got the problems of so many families that don't have computers, even though they can get them from the school. And how do you supervise that at home? And how do you supervise kids in classroom virtually? I mean, there are lots of problems. It's better than nothing, but I'm not sure it's the ultimate solution, and the less we have of it, I think the better. But it does require the teachers to be at school doing this. I believe that's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, that's a little different. And to quote a Gladys Knight song, I'm gonna milk this to death. To quote one of my favorite Gladys Knight songs, you got to use your imagination to make the best of a bad situation, to find a good reason to keep on keeping on. So you have to use your imagination, be creative about what you can do, to keep on moving, to keep teaching. Of course, it's a work in progress for JCPS with children and the like. It's a little different than what is taking place at the university. The demands at JCPS are just enormous for a variety of reasons. So they have shortages of teachers and so forth, and teaching young children is quite a different task than teaching adults in a college setting. So I think you have far more flexibility in a college environment than you ever will even dream of having in a public school environment. So I think that the fact that they have two different kind of criteria is to be expected. And my greatest concern also now is that many children are actually contracting the COVID, whereas before it was the teachers and the like who had it, but now it's actually students who are actually contracting COVID and spreading COVID. So that's a little bit different dynamic than what we were dealing with before. So
but there have been a lot of teachers that have, even though they've been vaccinated, have had to quarantine suddenly, and of course in a school system where you're exposed to somebody with COVID and suddenly you've got to be 5 days quarantine. That's a mess for scheduling teachers, substitutes, the whole mess. So it's much more complicated than we realize.
Especially if you have to be present in the school. Now, you can still be quarantined and still do some virtual. Okay. I know many people who are quarantining and still doing business meetings with COVID. So if teachers are required to be at school, it makes it very difficult for them to do that. So, it's a different challenge with JCPS. And I think I commend them for attempting to use their imagination to make the best of a bad situation.
When we talk about the University of Louisville, I'm concerned that at this point in the history of the University of Louisville, with an interim president, I'm sure this person is trying to do the best she can, but it's really not the leadership, the type of leadership that the university needs at this time. I felt that Dr. Bendapudi was an amazing president, and the fact that she left so suddenly, it will create more problems that need to be solved with immediacy.
And with every problem, there's also an opportunity as well, I think. So, I mean, it is what it is. You couldn't stop her, but it's another opportunity to get it right and to improve. So that's the challenge.
Well, Clay, I'm going to talk about your creativity, because I think that during this pandemic, we have seen all types of creativity for the children. And I think that expands their imagination as well as what they see on paper. So I think it's an increase in imagination, which I think is a good thing. And they're going to be able to tell this story of the pandemic to their children and their grandchildren and on down the line of, what we went through. I can just hear those stories. But I think that creativity is really an issue, and demanding that the teachers in the college setting, I think that's very difficult, because you've just got adults who, again, have underlying issues.
Mm-hmm.
There are shades of gray here, Sally. It's neither black nor white. And to say to a cohort of educators, you must be in the classroom. It's sad. People aren't listening.
All right, to follow along.
I think it's a matter of sometimes people get into control situations, and if they're in a classroom, well, I know where they are. If they're home, and sometimes in situations like this, you got to say, I got to trust people will do what is best. And most teachers, I think, certainly do their best at all of this kind of stuff. You're always going to have a certain percentage in any profession that are going to play the game, but that's not the way to control things.
All right, to play along with Clay Calloway's Gladys Knight theme, we won't take our midnight train to Georgia. We'll take our train to Frankfurt, and we'll talk about the Republican-led Kentucky General Assembly approved new
That's good,
redistricting
John,
maps
that's very
this week.
good.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
that
you,
is
Joe.
good, John.
Years of radio maybe gave me that segue. But the Kentucky General Assembly redrew boundaries to the state's legislative and congressional seats this week. This happens every 10 years to reflect shifts in population. Some Democrats are crying foul, but lead Republicans claim they made sure the new maps meet all legal standards. So on to our panel again on moral side of the news. Is this politics as usual?
John,
No.
would you mind if we fold in this issue with
Sure.
the next issue?
Sure.
With one particular person, Mr. Comer, whose new district begins in Western Kentucky and wins its way all the way to Frankfurt, which is definitely nowhere near Western Kentucky. If I was a constituent in that new district and I was at one end of the district, I would feel totally lost. I would feel that I had no representation whatsoever because the issues that are issues in Franklin County, I don't think are by and large the same issues that, especially with the tornado that hit that area, the issues that are all over the place in Western Kentucky. It's such obvious gerrymandering, and it would be wrong it was wrong for the Democrats to do something like this, as it is wrong for the Republicans to do something like this. It's just nonsensical. Rhetorical question. Why can't they just think of ways to give us leadership and answers rather than this craving for power?
Well, I think even more at root, we're talking about voting rights, and I know that's not our issue here, but I think a lot of things in our way of government, how we do elections, how we do districts, has really gotten manipulated out of hand because we can do all kinds of things with computers. We couldn't do some of this stuff years ago easily. Now we can do it easily. And I wish they had it seems like a bipartisan citizens group should be kind of looking at data and trying to figure out what's natural boundaries so people are represented well. And looking at the maps, except for Comer's district, which was like, what? It just seems preposterous. They did fairly well with some of the other groups now. But as long as we've got it's partisan are in charge of redistricting on either side, it's going to be a mess.
Well, I talked to some people who know a lot more about it than I do. I consulted with the president of the NAACP locally, who watched things like this much more closely than I do, and a state senator who gave me a quick course on the mechanics of it, not really giving an opinion one way or the other, just the mechanics. And it is there's a method to the madness. Now, they really don't know just what the impact is going to be just yet, with the exception of the Comer's district, for example, which seems a bit bizarre, but it's mandated by law every 10 years. The intent is to guarantee an equitable number of people that reside in each of the districts. That's the intent. So it's not an exact science, but it's a science that helps you to create some equity that otherwise may change because of shifts in population. So there is some method to the madness. They don't know how good or bad it is really yet until they get the data to really measure it. There may be some challenges in the courts that could be forthcoming. The one problem with these maps that were drawn and proposed is already approved now, is waiting for the governor to sign it, is that it didn't get a lot of public input. It was almost exclusively done by the legislators in Franklin. That, of course, could be a problem. But they didn't really involve the public. Neither party, as a party, did not involve the public in the process. So we don't know how good or bad it is until we have the data to verify it. And then, of course, the governor can sign it or not sign it. If he doesn't sign it, they can overrule it because they have enough numbers to mandate it. So it's moving forward. And we've been doing this thing since we created the Constitution in the state to do it. So it remains to be seen just what impact it will have. It does affect some so-called minority majority districts. For example, I've heard that, but we don't know whether that's good or bad yet. So it kind of remains to be seen just what impact it will have. Once the data is there, of course, you can verify it. Like Ronald Reagan used to famously say, trust but verify. We can verify it once the data is available to actually dig down into the numbers and compare it against the actual maps.
I'm concerned about the great divide, the divide between the rural and the urban, and what this does in that configuration, because we know that the rural is much more conservative than the urban. And so is this a way to manipulate all of that because the people in power are going to choose to manipulate it?
It could be, but if you look at the symbol for Kentucky, it represents, it captures that dilemma, Sally. There's a kind of a frontiersman in his buckskin attire, shaking hands with a well-tailored attired statesman. So the symbol for Kentucky is made up of just that, with that reality in mind, the urban and the rural, and we've managed somehow, how imperfectly, but it has been practiced in this state for many generations. Of course, we saw it played out in the election cycle, of course, with the last election cycle, with the national election in particular. We saw where Joe Biden, happily, he only had two little blue dots, like two eyes peeping out of the state, in Louisville and Lexington. The rest of the state was red. So that tells you something about the state. So that's an urban, rural kind of comparison. The two largest metropolitan areas voted one way, and the rest of the state, which is predominantly rural, voted another way. So that last election really told us story of what already exists within the state. So,
yeah, and
it's united we stand, divided we fall,
right,
which is our problem. And just, Sally, just before, if you looked, I saw the other night a map of the United States and all the counties that were red versus the ones that are blue. And what happens is you've got the two coasts, East and West Coast, and scattered metropolitan areas, and 90% of the country, 85% of the country is rural. I think that's part of our division right now. The rural does not trust the city, and the city is like, oh, come on, rural, get with it. And we've got that divide, which has got to be healed somehow. And maybe that's what Sally wants to say.
Well,
ideally,
two sets of socioeconomic realities. So, and also the myth upon which they live. The rural has a particular myth, and the urban has a particular myth. And so it's a meshment of those to create, again, for the common good. And can we do that with the division that we have between the two?
Now, Sally, I was just told, and by Senator, he shared this with me. The premise of the redistricting is based on the one man, one vote principle. That's the ideal.
Not one man, Clay.
One person.
One person.
Well,
thank you.
Okay, well, I'll qualify that. stand corrected.
Remember Gladys Knight? Okay, she's
I
correcting me.
did. So it's based on that principle. So it's really about the math. Every vote should be it. In fact, the
Math?
problem with the political climate is not based on that one person vote. If you recall, the popular vote does not always win an election. We saw that in the presidential elections.
Right.
So and that's the problem. So if it's purely one person, one vote, then that would be much more democratic. And this is an attempt to achieve that one person, one vote principle. So that's it. And it gets twisted when you get into gerrymandering, more like jerry rigging. But that is the principle upon which this mandate to redistrict is based.
Okay, panel, we only have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you, did you make any New Year's resolutions for 2022? Have you already broken any, or do you don't even care about that? Just give me a few seconds on each, some thoughts about New Year's resolutions.
I want this year to be much better than the last two.
Excuse me.
I mean, I want this year to just be phenomenally positive and looking forward progressively.
I'm just trying to rebuild my house from last year's fire. I mean, I'm leaving here to receive some windows. So I'm just trying to get back in and keep living my life the way God allowed me to survive the fire. So that's a simple and very concrete goal for me in 2022.
I think working on my health is obviously number one goal, but number two has been, I want to bring more hope and positivity to every situation. And so far, I've been hanging anywhere with that. But I said, I got to look at the hopefulness and the positivity.
Just hope that our community strengthens itself and that we will once again talk with one another and not at each other.
And my goal is to get like Clay Calloway and learn more about the repertoire of Gladys Knight and the Pips. How's that? All right, panel. Thanks for this new start to the new year on Moral Side of the News. Thank you, Sally McClain, Stan Miles, Clay Calloway, and Joe Graffis. We'll be back again next week with another edition of this program, Moral Side of the News. Thanks for watching and listening. Happy New Year, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, panel. The 69th annual WHAS Crusade for Children is set for June 4th and 5th in 2022, but you can get involved now. Just go to WHAScrusade.org and see all the ways you can make a donation to the Crusade for Children and make a secure donation online. That's at WHAScrusade.org. You can also mail your donation to 520 West Chestnut Street, Louisville, Kentucky 40202. That's 520 West Chestnut Street, Louisville, Kentucky 40202. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Moral Side of the News. We'll be back again next week with an all-new conversation.